let's call this meeting to order at 6:35. Welcome to the joint Planning and Policy and Urban Village Development Commission meeting. First thing, Lucy, would you like to go over commission membership, which is technically the first agenda item that we often do?
Well, I want to introduce Ben Rush, who's a new member of the UVDC. This is his first meeting in 2017.
Line 2.
His first meeting ever, and his first meeting
Okay.
in 2017. Thank you for clarifying. I don't think we can do the minutes because we don't have a quorum from the UVDC.
Fair
We only
point.
have 3 members.
Okay, we'll see if anyone.
Okay. So this evening, we are starting the process of ending 2 development agreements. I'll go through that in a minute, but you'll notice that both the UVDC and PPC are here. It's a joint meeting. The UVDC has been working with the development agreements for 20 years, and so it seemed important that they were sort of the lead on unwinding these. But because PPC will be getting whatever product comes out of it, we decided that having joint meetings and going through it together would be a good way to get the best result, having both parties participating. So that's why we're here tonight. And so I'm going to run through a version of the memo that you all received, and this is a very informal meeting, so feel free to interrupt me as we're going through if you have questions. No need to wait till the end. So, development agreements. These are authorized by the state, and they are contracts between a property owner and a city. They do not automatically expire, at least the ones we have written in Issaquah do not automatically expire. There is a build-out period in which the regulations are set unless both parties agree to change the regulations. And after the build-out period, they can continue indefinitely, or one party could ask to terminate the development agreement. In this case, Port Blakely Communities, who is the master developer of Issaquah Highlands, has asked to terminate the Issaquah Highlands development agreement. The city has instigated terminating the Talus development agreement. And the city is also recommending the termination of 2 other development agreements, which you can see on here. The little pink area right here, next to the Park and Ride and just north of Regal Cinemas, is the TOD, Transit-Oriented Development Agreement, which is where the YWCA Family Village and Z Home is located. And then the WashDOT TDR Development Agreement are the green parcels down here. Pinecrest, which I'm circling, and Sunridge, which I'm circling, are essentially built out. So because we're already going through this work on Issaquah Highlands, we're recommending doing that, but we're recommending leaving the development agreement in place for Bellevue College. Any questions?
There is no expiration period, but what is the lifespan of the Bellevue College?
I think it's, that's a good question. Let me just look at that. I think it's 2040 is my memory. It's longer than...
It's 2040.
Okay. So it's longer than the one for the residential portions. They got a longer opportunity to build out.
And part of that was recognizing that if you were actually going to build a college campus, it was likely going to take longer than 15 years to do that. So that was part of the negotiation of them buying the property in the first place.
So yes, it is 2040 for Bellevue College and 2025 for the residential areas. And since they're complete, that's why we were making that recommendation. So what is the process? The development agreements have a little bit of process, but it's essentially like a rezone. So we are required by the development agreement to hold a public hearing, which we will do. We will have a notification process, just like we would with a rezone. And we began this in the spring of 2017. Sorry, the sun's right in my eyes, so I keep stepping further and further to the... No, it's the high window, actually. So the screen's closed, but it's coming right through the little slot. Anyway, whining. So we started the process in the spring with presentations to the Issaquah Highlands community, the Taos community, the city council, and the administration. So what are staff's goals? There may be other goals, but these are the ones that we've identified. The first one was to retain the character of each urban village. Second was to create as few non-conforming situations as possible. By non-conforming, we mean that if something is legally built under one set of rules and the rules change and the building or setbacks or use no longer conforms with the new rules, it's considered a legally non-conforming use. Now, sometimes you can't help but create those, but it's our goal to try and avoid that. We'd like to have rules that are more consistent with the rest of the city, mainly just to make it easier for the public, for the homeowners associations, for staff, to just not have to manage so many different sets of rules. But we're going to do that where we don't think it'll have a significant impact on the character of the urban villages. And then the fourth goal is to consolidate the TOD and WSDOT TDR areas into the Issaquah Highlands, which generally makes sense because they were based on that development agreement. That their architectural review committees review the project, so there's already a lot of interrelatedness between the two. So here are some of the things that we're planning on doing. First of all, we're looking for places where there's city policies, guidelines, and standards that are universal. Things that don't affect character, that could be consistent from one area of the city to another. We're looking at unique goals and guidelines that apply, that we feel are part of what created the character of that urban village, and retaining those. Retaining certain development standards that we think are, again, unique to that urban village. So it could be setbacks, it could be heights, it could be other development standards. Now, both Taos and even more so for Issaquah Highlands had very broad range of uses. So, for example, in Issaquah Highlands, it might say almost every single parcel in Issaquah Highlands says the allowed uses are retail, commercial, residential, recreation. When you bought a piece of land, you couldn't do anything with that land unless you also bought entitlement. So you bought a piece of land and then you bought 30 residential units or 50,000 square feet of commercial or 20,000 square feet of retail. So even though all those uses were allowed, the entitlement really told you what you could do. But then when you go and you look at the range of uses that are associated with that, a lot of them are, again, much broader than what's been developed. So we're looking at narrowing that down to a smaller range that we feel will maintain the consistent character. We're also establishing a private community facilities zone. The way community facilities are in the rest of the city, it's generally a public agency. City, fire department, school district are probably the three most common ones. We're thinking of the homeowners association as almost like a public agency for the urban villages, so that where they own property, whether it's a park, an open space, a community center, any of those kinds of facilities, that should have sort of a similar zone on it, because that's kind of held by everyone. And that will help the zoning uses and the way people look at the map convey the way that land is intended to be used.
How's that currently zoned? Those
Urban
specific-
village.
Okay, so just the same as
Yeah,
everything
it's
else.
everything's zoned the same.
And this is land that's publicly used, or some of it's like kind of semi-public? Is it a mix?
I know there's those large chunks of
The
parkland, but
reason I was smiling and looking at Jennifer is she's been doing a very, very in-depth evaluation of every single parcel to see the uses that are allowed on each piece of property in the plats. So sometimes it's access, utilities, open space, recreation.
so it's a pretty broad mix of stuff that would be
Right.
in there. Okay,
But it's not usually buildings,
sure.
unless it was like a
Like a picnic shelter or something like
Exactly.
that. Okay.
But, I mean, that's part of what we're still sort of digging through to make sure before we put, because when you look at the city zones, and that's, I'm getting into the weeds, but it hopefully will be a good introduction for next week or next meeting. It's not just a CF zone, it's CF REC for recreation, CFOS for open space, CFF for facilities. And so to be able to decide whether it should have OS, rec, or facilities, we have to know what is, not just what it's used for now, but what it's entitled to be, to make sure we're not removing a right.
So are we creating a new CF zone, or are we going to take the existing CF zones and apply them when
We're
that's
talking
when
about
appropriate?
using a new zone. It's going to have exactly the same letters, except it's just going to have a P to indicate that it's private.
Okay, so there'll be a new CFP zone that will, okay,
That's the thought right now.
sure.
And then the last piece is, a lot of the Central Issaquah standards started in urban villages and then have gone into Central Issaquah. And so where those standards are similar or the same, we would use those rather than retain, say, separate parking standards for the urban village and Central Issaquah. So here's the chart that you received in your packet. So we've kind of divided, yeah.
So on that thought, if we're going to kind of unify Highlands and then Central Issaquah, so what comes out of the moratorium process will also then impact the Highlands?
Right.
Okay.
So in these four sort of pots that we are starting with, there's a group of things that would be terminated because we don't feel those things are needed anymore. So the main body is the main contract. Capital facilities is certain kinds of infrastructure and equipment that was required as part of the development agreement. Many of them had a master transportation financing agreement in terms of major roadways or building an intersection or improving roads to the project. Those have all been completed. Issaquah Highland had quarry standards. If you've been around long enough, it used to be a quarry where Grand Central Plaza is, not Grand Central, Grand Ridge. And obviously, no more quarrying's going on there. Then there are Issaquah Municipal Code, or IMC, standards that we think are, these are the kind of universal standards that we're identifying. So affordable housing, critical areas, Environmental Policy Act, which is a state set of regulations, sustainability, all of our utilities, how utilities are designed and built, and then impact fees. So all of that would use the city standards in the IMC. Central Issaquah would be quite a few of the standards. The whole Central Issaquah Code would be available where there weren't standards written just for the urban villages, so you can see there are quite a few. And then the right-hand column are the pieces that we're proposing to take standards from the development agreements and move them into their own section to retain the character. So the goals and objectives and urban design guidelines, that those appendices now would just still be available for reviewing future permits. Land use standards, I've listed some down at the bottom. In thinking about this, there were things like parks, plazas, and trails that had standards in the development agreements that really don't have an equivalent standard in either Central Issaquah or the municipal code. So we're proposing carrying kind of a streamlined version of those forward to cover either redevelopment or development or changes in the urban villages. VUNERFs, if you're familiar with those, sort of a shared pedestrian vehicular area. The Central Issaquah standards, because it's got some more density, those usually have a separate walkway even if it's on one constant plane. So we've proposed a set of VUNERF standards that we've been working with East Side Fire and Rescue and Public Works Engineering on. And then the processing piece that we're carrying forward, that we're proposing to carry forward, are major modifications. So for those of you who haven't worked with the development agreements before, there were a bunch of modifications, kind of like administrative adjustment of standards in the IMC world and Central Issaquah world. There were modifications that staff could make, and that had to be agreed to between the master developer and staff. But then there were certain kinds of changes that you couldn't do without going to council. And so quite a few of those we're proposing to carry forward. Going higher, adding density, changes of use. Can't remember them all. But anyway, they're things that, again, we think would be a change to the character and a significant enough change that it should be a council decision with public input. So any questions here before I move forward?
Yeah, I don't know if it's even possible to do what I'm asking, but I'm wondering if there's a, thank you. Yeah, for each column, if there's a way for those bullets to identify more strict or less strict or something like that to ensure, without going in or saying what's from A to B. So it was this way in the development agreement, and now we're adopting this utilities regulation from the municipal code. Does that mean, what's the significant change about it, as an example?
Okay. Based on Lindsay's question, I had already planned a question she had emailed in today asking for better understanding. So first of all, we'll send links out with the next packet to development agreements, Central Issaquah, and IMC. We have, to some extent, maintained a list of some of the changes some of the things that would go away. I'm not sure that we could do it. I mean, I think we can give you a sense of whether we think this is a change or what is being dropped, but I don't know that we can.
Even as I was thinking of the question, I recognize that it's very subjective and, very qualitative, not quantitative.
So would it be helpful maybe if staff provided the rationale for the recommendation? So in other words, like for utilities, it's what was adopted in those development agreements is either 15 or 20 years old. And so the rationale for somehow trying to, keep that alive for any longer, that's an easy conversation to have, right? Best management practices in the industry have just evolved over 2 decades, right? So I think in some ways we could do that. That's a fairly easy exercise because I think we know the rationale for why we're proposing to either keep in place, to go to Issaquah Municipal Code, or to go to Central Issaquah. So that might be helpful for the commissions to see that thought process. And I don't know that that's really unpacking this too far. I think we could probably do that. Would that be helpful?
Certainly that type of thing would be very insightful, and okay, we're going to an updated code, makes complete sense. I think commission members and probably residents of any of the affected areas would probably want to know, did something, lighting, for example. I remember many lighting discussions, Talus here and others, and if things got opened up because we're adopting things for Central Issaquah standards, which might have very different standards than Hillside standards, that would be important to say, okay, we've changed it and this is what it looks like.
Sure.
Thank you.
Or
Or,
kind of the same question. I know that you had meetings with Alice and the residents up in the Highlands. Did any of what they said go into where you put these things, where you decided to keep or not keep? Did any of that, or is that down the road of?
You know, I think, so as I said to Tara when we were visiting before this started, the city has a lot of experience starting development agreements. We're learning about how to unwind them. And so I think one of the things that has been so helpful about going out into the community is the kinds of things people ask about. That, you know, if I have a home occupation, will I still be able to do that? If I have, will fence standards change? You know, I mean, it's sometimes very little things that people were asking about, but they were really good questions in terms of how do these things compare? Is this significantly different? And so I don't think that there was any direct result. It was more helping us make sure that we were thinking through the kinds of things that people were concerned about and understanding if there was, if something, you know, whether there was going to be a significant change or not.
In essence, you did listen to them, and that's what I'm getting at.
Yes, we
I
do
mean,
try and listen to the public when they speak.
So I think one of the biggest things that I remember from the Highlands meeting specifically was there were a couple different questions about land uses for the properties that had not developed yet. So as Lucy mentioned on the previous slide, one of the things that we did was take the existing land uses and come up with kind of more of a subset, a smaller range. We will spend a lot of time, I'm using my crystal ball, we will spend a lot of time talking about what's being allowed to move forward. And it will, you know, it affects not only the properties that are undeveloped right now, but also as things might potentially redevelop over time. So those will be very specific lists for, one for Talus and one for the Highlands, which I think we'll spend a lot of time on.
Okay. So speaking of land uses, typically, when you do zoning, you know, you, for instance, have single-family 5,000 square foot lot. And if you were going to go out and develop it, you would say, I have an acre property and I'm allowed to have 5,000 square foot lots, and that goes into it 8 times, and therefore I can have 8 lots. It's a little bit different at Issaquah Highlands because part of, and Talus to some extent, the, particularly at Issaquah Highlands, the master developer did pretty small parcels, sold to lots of different people, targeting different kinds of product. So you might have a very expensive division of very expensive houses across the street from division of more modest houses next to a series of townhouses next to a mixed-use product. And if we were going to do traditional zoning, we would have to calculate the lot size on every single one of those lots and try and figure out, are we going to have some that are a little smaller, non-conforming, or are we going to pick the smallest one and then some of the big ones could subdivide? So instead of trying to do all that math, what we came up with was a little different version, since what we're trying to do is keep the character that's there. So if you think about a single-family neighborhood, the zoning on it would have all the development standards for single-family: heights, setbacks, uses. But instead of having a density size, such as 5,000 square foot lot, we just say, if you have a single-family lot, your entitlement is 1 house. If you subdivide your lot, you can subdivide your lot, but you have no entitlement to put on that lot. So it doesn't really encourage further subdivision. For a multifamily parcel, you would actually be given a specific number. So if you've purchased 135 units of entitlement, residential units of entitlement, you would have 135 in your overlay. Likewise, if you had commercial property, if you had 90,000 square feet of entitlement that you purchased, you would get that on your property. So if you had used all of it, you would be done. If you haven't used all of it, then you might be able to build a later phase. But you wouldn't get more entitlement than you have right now.
And then what would be the mechanism for creating new entitlement in the future?
So that's going to be a discussion item of whether we want to do that. Probably the mechanism that we've identified so far is Issaquah Highlands is a TDR, Transfer of Development Rights, receiving site. And so if the community and council wanted to keep that level of sort of flexibility available, you could allow someone to, you know, if a multifamily project was going to redevelop and they wanted to have 10 more units, they could buy 10 transfer of development rights and be able to increase the density of their project.
So what we talked about was both change of uses and increase in density would be analogous to a rezone, which is a council process. So like, let's say, so right now you own a piece of property, the zoning is multifamily and you have 200 units on it. If I wanted to instead build commercial or retail, I would have to get the council to approve that. So that would be an application that would go through the process and ultimately would be a council decision. That's what we're proposing at this point, but that is one of the things we get to talk about through this process.
Parks or open space, they would have certain development standards or uses that are allowed, but they would have zero entitlement because we're not building a use on there. And then we've already talked about changes in the future. So unbuilt properties, this is Talus and Issaquah Highlands. There are a number of properties that are in the process. At Talus, there is this property, which is kind of colloquially called Emmerich. Here's the entrance, and you can see the ponds. It's got a steep slope through the middle, and there's no opportunity for a road connection. So even though it would be part of Talus, it would connect to SR 900. There are two pieces of property that the city either own or will own. This is looks like a piece of park property, and it might remain a piece of park property. But it right now has entitlement for 6,000 square feet of retail, and so we would retain that, but then there would be a council decision if that was ever to move forward. Same with it's about a quarter-acre piece of property at the base of the reservoir in Talus. It is where the sort of construction trailers are, and it is entitled for 10 dwelling units. And then the last is a large piece of property down here, which is entitled for 510,000 square feet of commercial. They have asked for this to be converted to residential entitlement. Right now, there hasn't been a position from staff on that. And so that's just a question out there for discussion. At Issaquah Highlands, some of the pieces that are on here are in motion, but I kept them on here just for discussion's sake. Track D was just, the city owns that, and as part of the West Ridge, that's this area out here, development, it was identified for 10 single-family homes. West Ridge, the 223 represents the transfer of development rights, some affordable housing, and remaining entitlement that they have. They already have a townhouse project that has been approved in that area, and they're going to be submitting soon on another townhouse and a single-family plat. So we expect those to have moved through the process this year.
And so those will consume presumably most of that 223?
It will consume all of it.
Okay.
The Homeowners Association of Issaquah Highlands owns this property kind of across the street from SIP and Cafe Ladro. They're looking at building offices there. This parcel behind Marshall's is it's owned by Sumitomo, but Trammell Crow Residential is looking at developing it, and we have received a land use permit for 135 units, which is their entire entitlement. This parcel here behind Dick's is what many of you have heard about, City Surf. They have an entitlement of 90,000. They're proposing on using 10,000. And then Shelter Properties owns this sort of reverse L, and they own about 1.8 million square feet of retail and commercial.
What happens, for example, when Block 20, if they build something that doesn't fully consume that, what happens to that excess entitlement? Can they use it elsewhere?
That's one of our questions. That
Okay.
is whether, I mean, when the master developers were active, what would happen is often they would sell it, and once you developed it, anything you didn't use reverted to them.
So the construct that we've developed, though, that entitlement is with that parcel. So because it's an overlay that goes with that property, so let's assume City Surf only builds 10,000 square feet, and in 20 years, though, somebody else wants to buy that and then build a 90,000 square foot hotel. That could be done under the existing construct that we put together. So I don't know that it transfers. I think it runs with that property.
Right, I'm not suggesting that it does, but those are the kinds of questions that we need to sort out, is whether it's transferable, whether, does it disappear after a number of years? Is it there until some kind of other city process?
So I've got a question here. Looking at the Shelter Holdings property, the reverse L, if we apply new standards, CIP standards to that, well, when they build that out, would it be built out to the Highland standard, or would it be built out to the proposed CIP standard? If we made a decision in this committee to approve your recommendations.
I don't entirely know. They are proposing to submit a plat, preliminary plat and final plat. Each of those vest you for a period of time. I think that the question is, what does it vest you to? I know it vests you to certain entitlement and development standards. I don't know if it vests you to everything. That's a question that we haven't gotten to the city attorney to, and they're sitting here, so I'm sure they have an opinion as well.
So I think, if I heard your question right, Ron, I think it's kind of a Frankenstein. It's a little bit of both. And it's hard because we're actually now starting to talk about what code would actually come with this. So some of the things, that chart that Lucy showed earlier said there's certain things that we're proposing either be standard city code or central Issaquah. But then there's a whole bunch of stuff that's going to be specific to the properties in the Highlands and to Talus. So for example, building heights and setbacks and land uses will all be specific to each of the post villages, but something like parking and lighting might be central Issaquah, right? So it's going to be a combination of some of this and some of that. At the end of the day, at least that's what we're proposing, so that we're not duplicating a whole set of standards for the Highlands and for Talus, and then have one for central Issaquah and one for central Issaquah, and then one for Old Town. You end up with like 12 sets of standards, and it gets a little confusing. So one of the things, again, part of the proposal that's on the table is there standards, and this will get, I think, to what Carl asked for, is there standards that we can use in the Highlands and Talus that from somewhere else in the city that doesn't cause us to create a new one? If there is, then that's something that we may want to propose as being a starting point. If through the conversation we have here, it's decided, no, that's a bad choice, then we can always either, one, develop a set of standards for a particular subject that might be village related, or go with maybe overall Issaquah and not central Issaquah, or, I mean, those are our choices, I think. I mean, I think one of the things that Lucy said early, and I want to take you back to that, is we're trying to consolidate our codes and our rules as much as we can. I think we see that as a positive outcome, because right now we have rules for the Highlands, rules for Tallis, rules for central Issaquah, rules for Old Town, and rules for the rest of the city. And that's a lot of different rules to try and get right and keep track of. So,
Okay. So what would be the public benefit of going with, moving forward with the CIP then? And these properties are going to be developed then maybe to the CIP standard. So is there a public benefit for us to do that? Because it sounds like they may have the option of being built out of character using different standards that may not be, that might change the character of the buildings as opposed to the environments that they.
So the central Issaquah standards that we are proposing are ones that are very similar or the same as the ones that are in the urban villages now. And so those are, that's why we're retaining certain standards just for the urban villages, because we feel those are the standards that are essential to retaining the character.
So this is a administrative optimization effort as opposed to a public benefit.
I disagree. That isn't what
Well,
I'm.
that was a question.
What?
no, I think it's a balance. I mean, I think what we're trying to do is, so our perspective, and this is part of the conversation, is, Issaquah has very unique and identifiable neighborhoods. And I think one of the things that we're not trying to do with this process is turn Issaquah, Highlands, and Tallis into central Issaquah. We believe that there's value to maintaining the distinction between the neighborhoods. And so how do you do that and bring forward some codes that allow those differences to continue without having completely three different sets of standards? So we've gone through the mental exercise of saying, okay, what is close enough, and some of those we think are close enough to what's in the development agreement now to say, you know what, let's go ahead and pick these things, and we'll go through that conversation, I think, maybe next time. But then what Lucy said earlier, and for those of you who haven't used the development agreements very much, taking the existing urban design guidelines for Issaquah Highlands and just adopting it by code, that's 64 pages in and of itself that talks about neighborhood types and landscaping. And so that character piece, one of the things that we started to do was to say, well, maybe we could summarize those, and then it started to be, well, wait, we as staff don't want to pick and choose what might be important to the community. Let's just take the existing character piece, which we think are the design guidelines, and just basically attach them to the ordinance, which creates the new code. And so it'll stay as they are for all time until somebody wants to change them in the future. So that was the starting space, because I think we saw the value of we think that the folks that live in Tallis like Tallis, we think the people that live in the Highlands like the Highlands, and maintaining those distinctions as part of this process is an important outcome. So whether we've constructed this the right way or it needs to maybe get tweaked a little bit, I think as an outcome, hopefully we can point to our outcome and say, yes, this will keep those neighborhoods feeling distinct and different, because I think there's some value to that.
And one thing I would add, Ron, is that while we're seeing some value for staff, we see that value in terms of simplifying the rules as being even more important to the public. Because right now we get calls, people have a hard time figuring out where, am I in the municipal code? Am I going to central Issaquah? Do I need to find a development agreement online? that's just Issaquah. That is not something that happens in other cities. It doesn't make it particularly easy for the public to know which set of rules. If I want to build a deck, which set of rules do I use? Well, you start here and then you go there. You know, you need a guide dog to get through it all. So I think we think that that's not only advantageous to staff, but even more advantageous to the public.
Okay. Yeah, and I think towards the end, it would be helpful to know pros and cons of both options. That way we can, at least I can help visualize this thing.
And when you say both options, can you tell me what options you're talking about?
So the option of keeping the development agreement in place for the properties that are unbuilt versus going to the CIP. And I think that's probably a more complicated question than what is provided in the packet, but having the understanding of what are the pros and cons would help me make a decision.
Okay, thank you. So I think I ran through all of that. Okay, this was a slide we put together when we presented to council this spring and thought it might be a helpful thing to discuss with the commissions, why some of the urban villages might not want this. So one thing that we're proposing is to use the current critical area standards. It's been 20 years, and best available science has changed a lot. And so the buffers for streams and wetlands have increased, which means that some properties that are near those streams and wetlands may become non-conforming. Now, I think the thing I want to say is this has happened for all eternity in the city of Issaquah. You can imagine that homes that were built in the early days of Issaquah near the creeks, on the creeks, virtually in the creeks, have gone through this. And so it does not mean that a home that is now non-conforming because of a critical area can never change, nothing can happen. But there are some more restrictions on what can happen with a single-family home. If they want to add a deck, they may have fewer options about where that deck could go. Second is...
I think something that might be helpful as we get further in this process is to maybe quantify how many that is. I mean, would that be a heavy lift?
So we're trying to do that, but the state's made it really hard. And the reason is that up until the last change, which happened a year or two ago, buffers were a specific number. They are no longer a specific number. It is an evaluation based on a number of criteria in terms of the habitat value, the quality or classification of the critical area. So there's this whole list, and so you do not know the buffer until you've gone through that evaluation. So
how does, if I'm a homeowner who's near-ish a creek, how do I know if I'm at risk of being impacted? And, or even then more importantly, after we make a decision, how do they know if they've been impacted so that when it comes time for them to build the deck 6 years from now, they're even aware of any change?
So one thing that we have talked about doing, and we're attempting, I'm looking at Jennifer because again, she's our kind of been coordinating a lot with the GIS staff. We're trying to look at the buffers before the last change to see how much that affected homes outside of the established critical area tracts.
With the idea being the old numbers are a good approximation of the new
It may not be an
non-numbers?
approximation, but it would at least give us a starting point.
Okay.
But when a homeowner wanted to do something, they might have to go out and hire someone to do an evaluation.
Can you quantify how many homeowners will then need to do that evaluation? Maybe this is more of a SEPA question. So does this mean that if I'm a homeowner that's not nearish a creek and I want to build a deck, do I still need to go and pay someone to do an evaluation?
But we would have to, I mean, I understand your question because it's, how does staff, for instance, even know to let someone know that they need to do this?
Exactly.
That's a good question.
Okay.
Frankly, we did not want to go to this new system because it's unpredictable, and it's unpredictable for everyone.
But this particular thing is a state law, so doesn't it apply whether or not you're using a development agreement or a Issaquah municipal standards? Aren't they both?
So SEPA is state law. The critical area standards are administered by a state agency. They require that each city adopt new regulations to implement this new approach.
So going back to the way Ron posed it, where we have two options, kind of a keep or a change, don't both of those need to meet the critical area requirements since they're both under state law?
So staff, so you guys think there's an option in front of you, and you may ultimately recommend that we set in stone standards that are 20 years old for wetlands, because that's great, right?
Right.
Staff's not going to support that. We're going to tell you all the reasons why we think that's a bad idea, and the fact that it happens all through the rest of the city. Part of this conversation is us hopefully convincing you that we've kind of put it in the right spot. And if you guys ultimately don't agree, you guys can always recommend something else. But I think staff's going to say that there's a lot of reasons why we would not, say, preserve the existing wetland regulations.
On the other
Right.
hand, we do recognize that we need to help the commissions, the council, staff, and homeowners understand the possible magnitude of this.
No, I get that, and from everything I've seen so far, I think this is all what should be happening. I think my question is more, I'm wondering why we're highlighting the change in critical area requirements if, regardless of what we do, we still have to meet the state critical area requirements.
I think we were just trying to let you guys know that there might be a number of people that might see this as being a bad evolution for them personally based on their own housing situation, right? So it's not that we don't have some things that we need to do. It's just that there might be a number of people that say we shouldn't do this.
Well, so I think that we're trying as best we can with a lot of complexity to highlight, we're trying to be transparent about potential outcomes of this. So we may not have a choice, but we're trying to avoid the surprise.
I think maybe that's what I'm trying to drive at. I feel like whether or not we want to use a central Issaquah streetlight requirement or a different streetlight requirement is something the city has complete control over. Whether or not we meet the new state critical area requirements, we have to do that regardless of what we want to do. So I think it might be helpful, especially when in doing public engagement, to differentiate between, look, we need to meet these critical area requirements because it's state law, and then we just are bringing up to code that, versus, oh, we're suggesting doing this, and it's something that's discretion of the city, and we would like to have community feedback on where we land, and then differentiate between those two things.
Sure, and I think that's part of what Carl asked for earlier, which is why are you recommending this? And it's going to be, okay, yeah, state law, right? So stormwater is going to be the same way,
Sure.
right? So NPDS, all the properties in the villages are going to have to meet the new stormwater code.
That's a great point. If you cover that in Carl's request, I guess that's exactly what I'm
I
asking.
think we're going to get there.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
And while we're actually on that topic here, quick question kind of to bounce off of his. Let's say you have parcel A and it's actually now in a critical area because of the policy changes we're considering here tonight. That house has a driveway, and that homeowner 20 years from now wants to redo the driveway. How does what we're deciding here tonight affect that? Two, if they have an existing deck and they need to replace the deck, how does our policy decision affect that? And let's say they have a fire and have a total destruction of the house, and the whole property is within a critical zone. Would they have the ability to rebuild?
Right now, under code, yes. That one I know. I don't remember on the driveways and decks. There's a certain amount of maintenance that's allowed. So what we can do
So
is,
typically, as long as you're not increasing your nonconformity, you can do maintenance and replacement, right? So you've got a deck, You can replace your deck when it's time to replace your deck. You've got a driveway, you want to replace it, great. You want to add 10% to your driveway, so now you've got a harder thing to do. Now you've got to have a wetland, maybe a wetland person say of whether that's going to impact the wetland. So you got to go through, it's an extra hoop. It's not an automatic no. It's you have to go through some extra steps to maybe get what you're asking for, but it might ultimately end up in no. Whereas somebody who's, AJ, who doesn't have a critical area in his backyard, he's just doubled the size of his deck and he's super happy. So that's the difference.
Right.
It's about process, and it could result in no, but it doesn't automatically result in no. There's a process in city code if you're, wanting to expand something in a critical area.
So we'll put a summary and also provide maybe the code so that someone who wants to read about what the implications of this might be, because that's a completely valid question.
Yeah, that'd be helpful. Thank you.
Yeah. Second bullet is, as we've mentioned, some of the unbuilt properties are asking for changes, so people may not like what the change that they're asking for.
And that would be, for instance, going back to the unbuilt page, like the backwards L being developed differently, or
Right.
the Bellevue property.
Right, they've
being
asked
built.
for mixed use entitlement, and then the parcel 17B at Talus has asked for their commercial to become residential.
So we could, in theory, say yes to that request via this process, by what
Yes.
comes out would be their new use as opposed to the old use.
Yes. I mean, we'll have an administration recommendation as part of that process.
Sure.
And there will be a commission recommendation. At the end of the day, the council makes the decision, right?
Right.
But, and just to cue this up, so you guys know why there's people sitting in the back of the room, at least some, those property owners will be talking to you guys as part of this process to help you guys understand maybe why they would like for you to consider a different land use than what's currently on their undeveloped property.
Cool.
Yeah.
We're only using the L-shaped property because we all know it. So we're not picking it out because it's.
Well, there are only a couple of properties where they've asked for something different. Most people are, as far as we know so far, are fine with the entitlement they have. What they want to make sure is they understand the rules, like changes in uses or other things, to make sure that doesn't conflict with what they want to do. There's only a couple of properties that have asked for changes in the allowed use from what they purchased. So some rules and processes will change as we try to do this consolidation. We think that's a benefit, but that's a possibility. Tree protection will change. Right now, when you develop an urban village, hundreds, if not thousands, of acres have been set aside and protected with both Talus and Issaquah Highlands. And as part of the trade-off of that, the areas that were being developed were allowed to be completely cleared. However, the development agreement anticipated that as you get to the build-out period, end of the build-out period, let's say everyone's happy with the development agreement and no one wants to terminate it, and it continues. After the build-out period, there were tree protection regulations that were included in the development agreement. So it was anticipated that tree protection would become part of the urban villages. We're proposing not, and don't ask me what the difference is because I don't actually know it off the top of my head, but we're proposing using existing city standards, not the ones in the development agreement, but tree protection is going to go in, and that's been different than what's been allowed.
And that, sorry, and when you were referring to the tree protection, CIP allows clear cutting also, provided they pay into the tree fund. So what you're proposing is that it would be the same standard as what is in the early development agreement. So there wouldn't really be a tree protection.
So, Central Issaquah, when you're developing a piece of property, allows you to remove more trees than the city does. I'm not sure that I would say it allows you to clear cut. But going forward, as a single-family homeowner, for instance, you're only allowed to remove a certain number of trees each year, and that would be in place. So given that most properties are developed, they would not have the ability to come in and remove all their trees. But that's that's a point of discussion.
So most of the undeveloped properties, Lucy, that squeaky pen's going to drive me nuts. Most of the properties that are undeveloped in the villages are already cleared. So the tree retention issue is probably not. It's really what happens after. So most of what we're talking about is the trees that are there now, and whether or not and under what rules a property owner could remove trees as properties age but it's not so much about the undeveloped stuff now because they're not forested.
Yeah, I realize that this probably would be almost a mute discussion.
And then just general uncertainty. It's always hard when things are changing and not knowing exactly how they'll change and what the implications are. So next steps, we have 3 meetings with you guys to discuss this. The next meeting is 2 weeks from tonight. Next week, we will get out a draft of the proposed code. We will provide some information on, links to existing codes, some more detailed information to answer some of the questions. Let commissioners dig in a little bit more on what's there now and what's coming in. So we'll provide that next week. And then we meet a month after that to try and finalize a draft for recommendation. And then we'll be moving it through the sort of standard process from there. So if you want, we could take public testimony. And then we have one last item, small item on the agenda.
Can I,
What?
Sign-in sheets.
Oh, sign-in sheet.
It's up there.
Thank you for that reminder, Jennifer. So the sign-in sheet is up there. If you want to speak, please sign in. If you want to just be kept in the loop, sign in and just mark that you want to be kept in the loop, and that way we'll have email addresses.
I was going to say, if you want to take it with you and everybody who wants to speak can just go sign in.
Lucy, can I ask a question?
Sure.
Is there any engagement with the school district in this particular conversation? I'm just trying to connect the dots between this discussion that we're having this year and then the CFF rezone and the, not the donut, the island, King County Island rezones in order to incorporate.
So the annexation parcel's not in the development agreement, so this conversation.
Yeah, no, I get that they're strictly speaking independent, but I'm wondering whether or not we're engaging with the school district, if they have any thoughts on how we should be zoning these two lands that might be helpful to them.
So right now, we're just dealing with the properties within the urban villages. There is a school, Grand Ridge Elementary is in
Right.
the school. It would get a CFF zone.
Sure.
And whatever that is what it is. There are lots of discussions going on with the school district about all kinds of things.
So AJ, maybe this might help, although I don't think this was what you're asking. So part of the land use package that we talk about, like, so for example, for both of these gentlemen's properties that are undeveloped right now, that have commercial entitlement, would we allow schools there? When you look at the cadre of potential land uses that we're suggesting, schools show up there. So that's a conversation for those parcels within Talus and the Highlands and whether or not they could accommodate schools. The other one, the annexation parcel, because it's not covered by a development agreement, it's a different thing.
Right, yeah, I get that what we do with the annexation is independent of this. I'm thinking in the context of the need for the annexation. not the need, but the impetus behind the annexation in order to build the school there. Whether or not we should also be trying to help facilitate the school district to be able to build schools
So,
in other spots.
so by potentially identifying schools as an allowed land use within some of these undeveloped properties in the Highlands and Talus, I think we would be doing that.
Okay.
Right?
Yeah, and that was one of my questions, whether or not we're making sure to take that into account and making sure the school district is having their voice heard among many other people's voices.
Right.
And actually, sorry, question for the Bellevue College parcel, aren't there plans to change that to something other than Bellevue College?
So, not unless you've talked to the new president, which we haven't yet. So I don't know. I mean, so right now they have a new president, and whether or not they're planning something on that property, I have no idea. We're trying to get a meeting with him sometime soon. That's on my to-do list. So I have not heard anything from Bellevue College that they're even recognizing. They did answer an email. They recognize that their white land use sign is probably outdated and needs to come down, and they said they would take care of that. So we appreciated that attention to detail. So, but I haven't heard of any land use plans for the college property recently.
So Lucy, before we move to public comment, can I just invite any of the commissioners if there are any questions or comments before we do that? Or, obviously people have been open, but I want to make sure everybody's had a chance.
Sure.
Right? Tara?
I think more questions will come as you get into the detail of.
Sure,
Exactly.
And Ron and I don't need any encouragement.
Yeah,
so.
it's, none of us have been all that quiet.
Since you're the only one with the microphone.
Okay, so are you ready?
Yeah, let's go ahead
All right.
and move to public comment then. Thank you.
So the first person who signed up is Eric Evans. Mr. Evans?
Thank you. For the benefit of the record, my name is Eric Evans, 11624 Southeast 5th Street, Bellevue, Washington. I'm with Shelter Holdings. We're the elbow, or the L, that was mentioned here. We own land across the street from Swedish, obviously, and across the street from the Regency Grand Ridge Shopping Center. We're also the owners of Issaquah Terrace, just down the street, a nice apartment community. We own and are developing a variety of mixed-use, market-rate, mixed-income communities throughout the Pacific Northwest. And
Could I ask you to move the mic so that
sorry, yeah. So we are committed to the vision and the guiding principles of Issaquah Highlands. From our perspective, and we've been investing in Issaquah for over 30 years, the development agreement has worked great. It's been a wonderful tool to facilitate a lot of investment, predictability, certainty. I work in a lot of cities up and down the West Coast. I can't think of a development agreement that I have worked in where people have continued to participate in the project for over 20 years. So the development agreement for Issaquah is really a remarkable document. For our part, we're focused on delivering the mix of commercial and retail uses that were contemplated in the development agreement. I can also say that when we talk to employers, when we talk to the type of retail that we hear from the community, these business owners recognize the value of the development agreement. It provides a good deal of certainty for them. When we step out of the development agreement framework and we start thinking about new zoning, we think it's worthwhile to share with you some of the feedback and the work that we've been doing. As many of you know, some of you have attended some of our focus groups. We've had a series of 3 neighborhood meetings and 6 focus groups. We've commissioned a market study with a number of market professionals on the office, residential, medical office, retail, and residential markets up in Issaquah Highlands. And we shared some of those results with the community. these studies, when we got them, indicated that there was a very nice complementary market for retail next to the Regency Shopping Center that could support that 380,000 square feet and keep it vibrant. There was a nice strong market of medical office that can support the Swedish and Proliance campus and kind of work with some of the visions for the innovative partnership zone for sports medicine that the city's trying to bring. So it's a nice piece there. When we look at housing, you can imagine, it's pretty obvious, there's a real strong market for housing right now. There's a tremendous demand. I think, so a lot of good moments, but for the office market, it's much more limited. There's not as much strong demand for office, and Keith can share his experience in trying to bring office users to Issaquah as the economic development, but that part of the market analysis is the weakest part. When we talk to the medical office users and the employers, and we talk about bringing that sports medicine component to Issaquah Highlands, they very much value the Swedish. But what we do hear from them is that they ask us questions like, where are our employees going to live? And so when you think about attracting these types of users and creating that medical office, sports medical campus, we think it's worthwhile for you, when we step out of the development agreement, to consider some complementary housing that can support these commercial uses of that medical campus. I think it can be a very powerful tool to help bring those uses here. Similarly, when we think about retail and when we ask the residents about what kind of retail they wanted up in Issaquah Highlands, we heard a lot about uses that were very vibrant, that were lifestyle components, really nice restaurants, places to sip wine at night, to spend a couple hours out, watch the sunset. We heard about nice trophy grocery stores that would be a nice complementary, a different choice than Safeway, but still wouldn't undermine Safeway. We heard about health clubs, a wide variety of nice retail that is more of an entertainment, more of a specialty. When we went out to those types of tenants and we talked to them, what they said was Issaquah Highlands is great, but for them, what helps them is a 24-hour presence. When you think about a business owner opening a restaurant, it's nice to have a captive audience above. So to the extent that we can fold a little bit of commingled housing to support them, it'll help us attract the type of retail that the neighborhood, the community wants, and it's a little more destination. Last thing, when we talk to the residents, I can say they love it up there. They absolutely love being there. But I did hear, and a number of us did in the focus groups, a concern that they may not be able to stay. That as we all get older, the opportunity to stay in the community is a concern. There aren't a lot of senior housing options nearby. And a lot of the residents wanted the opportunity to stay close by, to be able to walk across the street to the hospital. So I think, and through this process, I think there is some value to thinking about allowing that type of use within this process of rethinking when we step out of a development agreement into a new zoning. I think as a vertical mixed-use component, a little bit of housing to support these uses can be a very powerful tool. To be clear, we're focused on delivering the commercial and retail. We intend to own it, we intend to hold it long-term, and I think it'll be lovely. But when we start thinking about a new framework, that's a consideration that we'd ask that you consider in terms of adding that allowed use. We're looking forward to working with all of you. Happy to answer questions. It looks to be an interesting and a fairly complex process, and happy to answer questions and continue to make Issaquah Highlands great.
Good. Thank you, Mr. Evans.
Yeah.
Next is Ken Bellamy.
Good evening. My name is Ken Bellamy, 7900 Southeast 28th, Mercer Island. I represent Talus Corporate Center, which is the 9-acre parcel at the entrance to Talus that you saw referred to before, right at the intersection of Talus Drive and SR 900. Just a bit of background on that. We have an approved site development permit on that property and have had for the last 10 years. We have worked with Keith and a number of other real estate brokerage firms trying to find a user to occupy that space, and we've been unsuccessful. And so with the termination of the development agreement, we thought we'd like the opportunity to discuss some change of use for something that's more consistent with the community that's there, the residential community, and also more something that has a shorter development time frame to it. That's really all I had tonight. If there's any other questions, happy to answer them, but I'd like to discuss it with you in more detail as you work through this process.
Not typically. I'll defer to Lucy on rules, but typically we haven't engaged in public comment in a bi-directional conversation, so no.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Bellamy.
So that's all that have signed up. Does anybody else want to speak this evening?
Me and my squeaky pen are back.
So the squeaky pen is back, so that means public comment is now closed. I took that as a no, correct?
Yes.
Just making sure. Thank you.
I need something to fiddle with. So,
Spinning wheels.
yes, I've had a lot of people walk in my office and said, I should have gotten one for you. So that's the end of our presentation on this piece. If you have questions you want to ask me, the applicants will hear it, and then we can talk with them separately in terms of how we may want to proceed.
So this was intended mostly just to be a primer for you guys.
Right.
To kind of point you in the direction that we've been pointed at for a bit of time now. I think, the next meeting, we're definitely going to jump into the fray, and I'm not sure how that's going to go down. I'm sure Lucy has a plan, so.
So I'll just, there were some questions about how the meetings might be structured. Typically, we would send you the code, you would read the code. We think it's going to be about 30 pages, which sounds like a lot, but really isn't that much. And that we would have a meeting to talk through it, we'd make edits, and then we would finalize it for the next meeting when we're asking for you to make a recommendation. But one of the things that I'm hearing that I'm not sure that we would review with you next time, but we would certainly answer questions, is it sounds like we're going to be putting together a tool to help you understand a little better what the original sources are and why we're making the recommendations that we are in terms of where things go to. So that's something I'll be busy with this weekend. And so we're certainly available to answer questions next time based on that. And one thing I just want to share, if you have questions while you're reviewing it, getting your questions ahead of time were great. We chose to answer a lot of your questions tonight. I don't know whether we've answered all of them, Lindsay. But it's really helpful if you have questions along the way to send them to us. We may not choose to answer them ahead of time, but it means we're much better prepared to have a discussion. I'm always impressed with how much you think we know that we can come in and answer immediately, but getting a little heads up is helpful in terms of us having a more thoughtful conversation.
We are very impressed.
So,
So Lucy, I also, in addition to talking about how you came about the idea of these particular code changes, the applicants in these cases, when they're looking at potential changes, how does that play into whatever we approve or recommend or anything like that? Or is it just kind of a side idea?
So that's a really good question. So I think the way we're thinking that this is going to come to you is in the same way that there is a zoning map for the city, and then that zoning map leads to a piece of code that says it can be 3 stories and have 10-foot setbacks. There will be a map that has those overlays. So there'll be a color, and that color is single family, and you know that means one house. And this color means it's retail only, or this color means it's mixed use non-residential or mixed use residential. So there will be some kind of map that we will have, as well as code that should tell you something about how those uses can be developed on that land. And I'm sure they'll be looking at it as closely as you guys are.
So if the typical way to do a rezone is to go through the city council process, if we're recoloring those areas, aren't we basically rezoning it without it going to city council?
Oh, no, it goes to city council.
So your recommendation will go to city council?
Yes, but it will be a recommendation of this is how the development agreement should be modified so that we can bring it into the city.
Right,
Oh, and then we're also changing these properties.
right.
I think I agree with Lindsay. I think from a process standpoint, it'd be really helpful to bifurcate those. And I think it might be really helpful to go through this collapsing the development agreement into more generic city code process, complete that, and then separately look at potentially rezoning some of the undeveloped parcels into
So-
something
so
different.
treat
Can we
the two-
break that into 2
Yeah,
steps?
so absolutely. So the ending of the development agreement and the code and all that can be one recommendation. And then these 2 gentlemen and their asks could ultimately be recommendation 2 and/or 3, depending on what you guys want to do with those.
But they're not sequential. I think that's
No,
what
they-
you're asking for.
they're all the
We're
same.
doing them concurrently.
And then I think it would make, to make the conversation would be much clearer, especially for people other than the commission and the gentleman with the request. I think it would be clearer for the average person to separate that. Why do you guys want to do that concurrently rather than
Because
Because
that's
there's
what
no
we're required to
zoning.
do.
required to do?
There's no zoning in the interim. So as soon as we end the development agreement, those parcels have no zoning.
Well, I know, but I
But
think,
couldn't we do it with the existing zones and then take up the idea of rezoning?
yeah,
So the existing zone is Urban Village SIA
It goes
Development
away when
Agreement.
the DA goes away, yeah.
So they can always ask for a rezone. They're choosing, they would like to do it with this process. I mean, a year from now, Eric can come in and make an application for the zone on his property to change from mixed-use non-residential to just mixed-use with residential, right? I mean, so he can do that anytime. He can do that every year for the next 20 years if he wants to. So that can always happen. I think what they've asked for, because this process is moving now and because we have to pick a zone for their property, they would like to influence that decision and get us to pick something other than what they currently own, which right now, as we, going back to step 1, what we tried to do was say, we're bringing forward a construct that will generally keep the villages the way they are, which would mean the existing zoning on all the properties. What they would like to ask for is 2 exceptions, one for Talus and one for the Highlands. And that's part of the conversation that we get to have. And you guys can say, no, we want to keep that separately. You guys do that a year from now or whenever. Or we could have that conversation. I would say if you want to at least allow that to play out, maybe in the next meeting to see what it feels like, then maybe what we can do on the agenda, and this is a suggestion for the chair, the sitting in vice chair. Are you the chair? No.
Yes,
So,
he is sitting in as chair.
so what we could do is actually have 3 agenda items. So we could talk about, DAs, and then we could talk about Talus commercial, and then we could talk about Highlands commercial retail. And so there's a specific place in the agenda for those conversations, and that may be more productive and allow the commissions to get to a cleaner end.
I think it would be important for public input on those, because those are obviously very big spaces that have a big effect on a lot of residents. And it would be easier to communicate to the residents that, where they would have a public hearing or input. Additionally, yeah, and I just forgot what I was going to say. Come back.
It was.
Don't you hate
You were
that?
on a roll. It was.
They'll
You
call
were
back.
doing really good. I think that's a great suggestion, Lindsay.
And I'll echo that for Lindsay. I don't want to punt on the second half of the decision. I just want to make so that they're
Clear,
separate
yeah.
discussions.
Yeah.
Yeah, no.
We can maybe tackle it in the single commission meeting. I just want those to be independent.
Right, and I
Opposite
think
discussions.
that is, in terms of agenda items, I think that's great, because what that means is that we can do sort of public comment with each piece.
Yeah.
And focus comments that, if there's more comments on one piece than another, then we'll be able to hear specifically on those pieces. So I think that's a great idea.
And I want to just be clear, we sit in my little office and make up these optimistic schedules where you guys like talk about things once and then approve it. So if you need more than 3 touches on this, I don't think anybody turns into a pumpkin. So just because Lucy said we're going to have 3 meetings and then you're going to be done, if we need an extra meeting or 2, we can fit that into the schedule. So
Always
we'll
blame
figure
the
that out.
staff presenter. That's,
Okay, I remembered my question.
you're welcome.
If separate from this, somebody wanted to go through a rezone of an undeveloped land plot, they make an application. Does that go through any commission before it goes? Which commission does that go to?
That goes to, I believe, goes to PPC.
Really? Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
So, as a tangent, as just to be transparent, the city administration's going to need to figure out what we do with UVDC. Right now, they're meeting once in a blue moon. As we keep getting rid of the villages, what's left is Rowley's. And so, I think.
Swedish and Lakeside.
And those. Since there's no action on either of those, I tend to forget about them. Sorry. So we'll have to figure out if we ultimately collapse UVDC into DC or do something like that. I don't know what the answer is, but we need to figure out what to do with you guys, because you may not ever be meeting. Yeah.
And I think when we discuss these 3 different conversations, it would be helpful to understand the pros and cons for the public benefit and the pros and cons for the developer.
For the landowner. Because
Right.
the developer's gone, yeah, so the landowner, yeah.
Yeah, I want to see the whole story, not just half the story.
You don't care about just what I think?
Well, that's what
I'm
I'm
kidding.
asking.
I'm kidding.
Okay. So that's it on this topic. Okay. So one just brief update, again for transparency. Last year, the commission, I don't know why it's showing that. There we go. Last year, the commission did an adjustment to the site development permit for Central Park to accommodate changes to the pad, the play area, the parking lot. The top image here is a snippet from that. At the time that we presented to you, we mentioned that this was a phased implementation, and there was a suggestion and discussion around parking and how that might be accommodated with the first phase. So I just wanted to give the commission an update on how phase 1 was approved. So this area down here is obviously this area here. They are moving forward with the changes to the pad and the lighting and.
I'm sorry, Lucy, where's Central Park?
I'm sorry, this is Urban Village Development Commission, so I'm assuming you're in the know. Apologies. Issaquah Highlands.
Okay.
Right next to Grand Ridge Elementary, if you know
Okay.
where that is, just east of there.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. And actually, in this image, north is not up, so to make it even harder, north is on this side, so this is east and west. But the two images are oriented the same. I did get that much right. So the full build-out plan is what's shown on the top, what's shown on the bottom. They are leaving the existing parking lot as is, but reusing, as the commission and public suggested and discussed, there is a paved area that was right here on the original plan. This paved area is being developed as additional parking, being striped so that to try and make Phase 1 work and look at ways to be economical and yet achieve the goals of Phase 1. So that was just an update on how that played out. And I believe it's under construction now. Okay? And that really is the end.
So that's the end, and do we have a confirmed time and date, or date and time for the next?
So the next meeting is the 15th, which would be the next typical UVDC meeting. And we'll look at whether 6:30 or 7 works better with other events that are happening. I don't know if you guys have feedback on that, and packet will be out next week.
Okay. Anything else from either commission? Okay. Thank you all, and we are adjourned.